In 1886, Robert Louis Stevenson wrote one of the most classic Gothic horror tales in history, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You probably know the story, and since it's been nearly 150 years, forgive me for not adding a spoiler alert here. But the twist reveals that the two characters personifying good and evil turn out to be separate personalities of the same person. This week, our plant is a lot like that, and its utility and notoriety depends on which side of it you're looking at. Side A is a pillar of industry, a hard-working crop that built the British Navy, clothed millions of people, and was so essential to economics that both British farmers and early American settlers were legally required to grow it. Side B is a chaotic drifter, a so-called moral menace that sparked a century of prohibition, was embraced by countercultures, and became a poster child for a $1 trillion war on drugs. I'm Megan Bream, and on this episode of The History of Plants, we're diving into the duality of Cannabis Sativa. Whether you know it as marijuana, hemp, weed, or another name, you'll hopefully agree that this is one of plant history's most famous botanical bad boys. It confused governments, anchored global trade, and forced humanity to ask a very difficult question. Can you separate the sinner from the saint? To find the answer, we have to go back millions of years to the moment this plant decided, so to speak, to lead a double life. This episode's going to go a little differently, where I'll cover the chemistry and history of one side of the plant than the other. But to understand our featured plant, you have to realize that for the vast majority of human history, Cannabis Sativa was strictly industrial. Far from being a recreational substance that worried your mom and made your uncle way cooler, it served as the duct tape of the ancient world, unglamorous but completely indispensable. However, it is, in my opinion, one of the most complicated plants to cover because you will get two opinions for every one historian on its classification, origins, and basically anything you can think to argue about. In a way, it feels like just another aspect to its duality, leaving its archaeo and paleobotanical roots ever obscured to researchers. One thing we do know is that it belongs to the Cannabaceae family, which makes it a close cousin to the hackberry tree and, more famously, hops, the plant used to flavor beer. We think that hops and cannabis diverged from a common ancestor nearly 28 million years ago and then split again into Cannabis sativa and Cannabis indica a little over 1 million years ago. So, some argue that sativa and indica are one and the same, just different subspecies. After that, things get murky because Cannabis sativa does not leave clear fossil records. Just to show you how complicated this gets, here's a map of all the locations botanists have found Cannabis sativa. It is enough to give anyone a migraine. The current leading theory is that our plant's story begins on the northeastern Tibetan plateau near Qinghai Lake around 34 to 20 million years ago. The plant slowly spread in between ice age cycles into East Asia and the Mediterranean. Some say fossil seeds have been found in Siberia and Bulgaria, both from the late Miocene epoch around 7.3 to 5.3 million years ago. However, this could be hop seeds instead. The science is still ongoing to figure it out. But we finally see the first human use of cannabis as a fiber between 12,000 to 8,000 years ago in the Neolithic era when our ancestors realized its stems contained long, incredibly durable bast fibers, the strong, woody inner bark that acts like the plant's muscle, holding it upright. This is the Dr. Jekyll side of the plant's biology, pure structure and discipline. These fibers are packed with cellulose and lignin, tough, rigid polymers that act like biological concrete, which made the plant a perfect material for creating bowstrings to hunt, shoes to walk in, and eventually paper to write on. In the Oki Islands of Japan, we found cannabis seeds, or achenes, dating back over 10,000 years, suggesting it was already being used for food and materials. In China, at the Neolithic village of Banpo, pottery shards from around 5000 BCE still bear the distinct imprint of hemp cords used to shape the clay. The ancient Chinese character for hemp, ma, depicts two plants hanging under a shelter to dry, a nod to the universal task of processing the stalks for fiber. It's listed as one of the 5 grains of ancient China in the Liji, the Book of Rites, where it sat alongside soybeans and millet as a pillar of the ancient diet. And for good reason. Hemp seeds are a nutritional powerhouse packed with protein and a near-perfect balance of omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. They provided the critical fuel needed to sustain a labor-intensive agricultural society. In the Shijing, or Book of Songs, a collection of poetry from around 1000 to 500 BCE, hemp is mentioned 7 distinct times, often describing farmers soaking the stems in ponds to prepare them for weaving, a task so common it basically became the background noise of everyday life. Across the Yellow Sea on the Korean peninsula, archaeologists have found samples of hemp fabric dating back to 3000 BCE, where it became known as sambe. While the rich wrapped themselves in silk, sambe was the fabric of the people, because it was breathable and so durable that it became a traditional fiber for mourning clothes, a final, humble layer that returned to the earth just as slowly as the body inside it. But the most impressive example of its sheer durability might be from India. In the Ellora Caves, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, scientists were baffled by how the clay plaster and paintings had survived for 1,500 years without degrading or being eaten by insects. When they put the plaster under a microscope, they found the secret ingredient. It was 10% cannabis fiber. The plant's strength and natural pest resistance had held the walls together for a millennium and a half. Speaking of things that last, if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, hitting subscribe is a great way to support the channel. It keeps the lights on and keeps the research flowing. From there, it hitched a ride west. Around 3000 BCE, nomadic horsemen known as the Yamnaya swept out over the Eurasian steppes and into Western Europe. Archaeologists have found cannabis pollen and seeds in burial mounds across Bulgaria and Romania that track perfectly with this migration. Their later descendants, the Scythians, would become famous for using the plant recreationally, but we'll get to that. And while they were spreading seeds across the steppe, the master builders in Egypt were already putting the plant to work, calling it Shemshemet. Soil samples from the pre-dynastic period, dating back over 5,000 years, show traces of cannabis pollen, proving that this plant was part of the Nile Valley's ecosystem long before the first pyramid was ever sketched. In 1881, when archaeologists examined the mummy of Ramesses II, they even found cannabis pollen hidden deep in his wrappings. Beyond the tomb, though, this plant played a critical role in the construction of the temples themselves. Now, if you visit a museum, you'll likely see endless displays of Egyptian linen. Linen was the star fabric, white, pure, and holy. Hemp was the stagehand, rougher, tougher, built for labor. That toughness mattered most at the moment a sacred building became real, the foundation ceremony. In Egyptian temple building, there's a ritual called, and I'm going to butcher this, I apologize, pedshesh, or the stretching of the cord. A measured cord was pulled taut to lay out the plan. Straight lines, clean corners, a building that would not drift over time. Seshat, the goddess of writing and measurement, is the figure tied to this act, which is why she keeps showing up in stories about chords, geometry, and plans becoming set in stone. Some writers argue that her 7-pointed emblem is a hemp leaf, but whether or not that's true, we're not sure. However, the engineering reality stands. You can't use stretchy linen rope to measure a temple foundation. Instead, you use hemp rope, which holds its shape. Going north, we find cannabis seeds in a Viking settlement dating back to around 500 BCE, showing the cultivation was stretching across the known world. Meanwhile, in 77 CE, our boy and frequent featured guest, the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, wrote in his Natural History that hemp made the best ropes for hunting nets and that the seeds could cure farm animals of constipation. Hardly a glamorous reputation. Around the same time, the Greek physician Dioscorides cataloged it in his De Materia Medica, noting its use for making strong cords and easing earaches, but more on the earaches part later. The word cannabis itself actually appears here for the first time. The Greek cannabis is the oldest written form we have, likely borrowed from either an earlier Scythian or Thracian word. But as the Roman Empire fell, the plant found a new champion in the Islamic Golden Age. In 751, at the Battle of Talas in Central Asia, Muslim forces defeated the Chinese Tang dynasty. According to legend, Chinese prisoners captured in the aftermath revealed a close-guarded state secret: how to make paper from hemp. That single transfer of knowledge fueled the intellectual explosion of the Islamic world. The Moors developed papermaking into a major industry, using cannabis, hemp, and linen rags to create the pages that would hold the knowledge of the world. Besides paper, we see the use of cannabis exploding throughout pre-medieval Europe. Palestinian Jews in the 2nd century published details in the Mishnah about its cultivation. In Germany and Italy, hemp seeds were boiled in soups, baked into pies, and used as filling for torts. It was a kitchen staple as common as lentils or peas. It remained so common that when the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus finally classified it in 1753, he gave it the name Cannabis Sativa, The word sativa simply means cultivated or sown, which is a nod to the fact that it was just another crop in the field, no different than wheat or barley. Once it reached medieval Britain, though, we really begin to see the West embrace it as a staple fabric. The word canvas, as in sails, comes from the word cannabis. A standard ship required around 60 tons of hemp for its rigging and sails, and since hemp rots in salt water, it had to be replaced constantly. So, in 1533, King Henry VIII realized that without hemp, he had no navy, and without a navy, he had no empire. Thus, he passed a law fining any landholder who failed to grow a quarter acre of cannabis for every 60 acres they owned. Queen Elizabeth I followed suit, increasing both the quota for growing hemp and the penalties for coming up short. The Spanish were the first Europeans to bring it across the Atlantic, landing in Chile in 1545. And when the English arrived in North America, they found something surprising. The locals were already using it. In 1605, the explorer Samuel Champlain found the Wampanoag people of Cape Cod using wild hemp for clothing and nets. Later in Virginia, the Powhatan people were farming it alongside their corn. Whether or not this was true cannabis sativa or a native lookalike is still debated, but for the colonists, it was a green light because they knew the land could support fiber crops. It became so vital that in 1619, the Virginia Assembly did the same thing as the British monarch they loved to hate, decreeing, quote, "For hemp, also both English and Indian, and for English flax and aniseeds, we do require and enjoin all householders of this colony that have any of those seeds to make trial thereof the next season." George Washington grew it at Mount Vernon for 30 years. There's a famous entry in his diary where he talks about, quote, separating the male from the female hemp. Some claim this means he was trying to boost the THC, but in reality, he was most likely just separating them because the male parts produce finer fiber for linen, while the females are kept for seed. So far, everything we've talked about, the ropes, the sails, the clothes, all rely on the plant's body. This is Dr. Jekyll at work. Useful, reliable, safe. But there was a moment that use shifted, a moment when healers stopped trying to fix the body and started to turn off the mind. To find the first doctor who prescribed this plant, we have to travel back nearly 5,000 years to ancient China and meet Shenyang. Legend says he was the divine farmer, a mythical ruler who taught China how to practice agriculture. Stories claim Shenyang wandered the forests, testing hundreds of wild herbs on himself to discover which were poisonous and which were medicine. He cataloged his findings in a book called the Ben Sao Qing, the oldest pharmacopoeia in the world. In it, he listed cannabis, or ma, as a superior herb. He prescribed it for everything from gout and rheumatism to absent-mindedness. But Shenyang was also the first to document its Mr. Hyde side. He wrote that while the plant could heal the body, taking too much of it makes one see devils and run around frenetically. He had identified the duality that would follow this plant for the next 5 millennia. It was a powerful medicine, yes, but it demanded respect. From Shenyang's detailed notes, the knowledge of this superior herb began to travel west, showing up in ancient Egypt around 2000 BCE. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in existence, dating to around 1550 BCE, recommended grinding the plant with honey, corn, celery, and cow's milk to treat inflammation, glaucoma, quote, cooling the uterus by vaginal insertion, and apparently makes a great enema for hemorrhoids. By the 1st century CE, the Roman physician Dioscorides had cataloged it, as he said, in De Materia Medica as a useful rope, but he also recommended boiling the roots to treat gout, inflammation, or juicing the green seeds to treat earaches. Oh, and he claimed that eating the seeds in large quantities would suppress sexual longing. So for Romans, apparently this was the anti-Viagra. But back to the east, the prescriptions got bolder. The Sharuda Samhita, a foundational Sanskrit medical text, recommends cannabis for phlegm, diarrhea, and, interestingly, surgical pain relief. The Atharva Veda went even further, listing cannabis as bangha, one of the 5 sacred grasses on earth, and specifically praised its ability to release us from anxiety. Its preparation, called bang, is considered one of the safer ways to ingest cannabis because it involves removing the flowering top while grinding and mixing the cannabis sativa with ghee or milk and spices. By 200 CE, a Chinese surgeon named Hua Tuo had taken it to the extreme. He mixed cannabis resin with wine and created mafishan, which translates to cannabis boiling powder, and was a drink so potent it knocked patients unconscious from major abdominal surgeries. Even today, the modern Chinese word for anesthesia is mazui, or cannabis intoxication. Over in 9th century Persia, physician Rhazes prescribed cannabis wildly for ailments ranging from migraines to syphilis. For centuries, the medical potential was largely ignored by the West, where hemp was still just a rope crop. But in 1839, an Irish physician named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy decided to bridge the gap. Working in Calcutta, O'Shaughnessy watched local healers use the plant to treat convulsions and rheumatism. Intrigued, he conducted the first modern clinical trials, giving tinctures to patients suffering from tetanus. In one famous case, he treated a 40-day-old baby with convulsions who, in his words, leapt from near death to the enjoyment of robust health in just a few days. When he returned to England in 1842, he brought the plant and his research with him. Across the pond, cannabis received a medical seal of approval by being added to the 1850 U.S. Pharmacopoeia as a useful treatment for a whole laundry list of ailments: heavy periods, tonsillitis, insanity, typhus, cholera, even freaking rabies, which, by the way, do not use cannabis for rabies. Go to a doctor, please and thank you. But the ultimate endorsement came from the highest authority in the British Empire. In 1890, Sir J. Russell Reynolds, the personal physician to Queen Victoria, wrote in The Lancet declaring cannabis one of the most valuable medicines we possess. He prescribed it for migraines, neuralgia, and menstrual cramps. While rumors that the Queen herself used it specifically for cramps are hard to verify, her doctor's endorsement is a matter of public record. For a brief window, this plant was the aspirin of the Victorian age. But just as Reynolds was writing his praise, the other side of the plant was beginning to stir. To understand the Mr. Hyde side of this plant, we have to zoom in. If you look at the flowers of female cannabis plant, they look like they've been dusted with sugar. Those tiny crystals are called trichomes. Think of trichomes as the plant's wee little chemical factories. Inside them, the plant manufactures a resin designed to protect itself from UV radiation and hungry pests. But hidden in that resin is a molecule called tetrahydrocannabinolic acid, or THCA. But let me be clear, it's not the THCA that gets you high. If you ate a raw cannabis flower, you wouldn't feel a thing. For the psychoactive effect to unlock, THCA has to lose a carbon atom, and to do that, it needs heat. This process is called decarboxylation and is like the chemical key that turns the non-psychoactive THCA into tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, the compound that fits perfectly into receptors of your brain and creates that feeling of being high. While they didn't know the molecular formula, our ancestors figured out the heat rule very early on. In 440 BCE, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote about a group of nomads called Scythians. He described how, after a funeral,
they anoint and wash their heads. As for their bodies, they set up 3 poles, leaning together to a point, and cover these over with woolen mats. Then, in the place so enclosed to the best of their power, they make a pit in the center beneath the poles and the mats and throw red-hot stones into it. The Scythians then take the seed of this hemp, and creeping under the mats, they throw it on the red-hot stones. And being so thrown, it smolders and sends forth so much steam that no Greek vapor bath could surpass it. The Scythians howl in their joy at the vapor bath.
Herodotus thought this was just a weird ritual, but textile expert Elizabeth Wayland Barber suspects it's the whole point, believing the plant didn't spread west just for the rope. It spread because people loved the saunas. Basically, the Scythians were the first to hotbox a tent, and the habit was so popular, it's possible it drove the plant's migration across the ancient world. As the plant moves into the Middle East, the method for finding said joy moved from burning into concentrating. By the 12th century, Cannabis Sativa's resin was being collected into potent blocks known as hashish, Arabic for dry grass. And this is where the Mr. Hyde reputation really begins. It starts with a small breakaway sect of Islamic militants called Nizari Ismaili, who fought their larger enemies using targeted political killings. Obviously, their enemies hated them and began calling them hashishin, the hashish eaters. It was the medieval equivalent of calling them junkies or lowlifes to discredit their cause. But when European crusaders encountered them, they didn't understand the insult. They misheard the word hashishin and morphed it into a new English word, assassin. Marco Polo later added fuel to that fire, spreading the myth that their leader drugged them with hashish to stimulate paradise and trick them into obedience. Whether or not they actually used the drug is debated, but the linguistic damage was done. The word for pothead had become synonymous with the word for killer. Moving back to Europe, scientists analyzed clay pipes found in the garden of William Shakespeare and found that 8 of the pipe fragments tested positive for cannabis residue. While we can't prove the bard himself was partaking, it suggests that the plant was being smoked in England centuries before the counterculture of the 1960s. However, the real explosion of recreational use in the West started with a shortage of wine. In 1798, Napoleon invaded Egypt. His French troops, accustomed to their daily ration of wine, were dismayed to find that alcohol was forbidden in the Islamic country. But they found a local substitute: hashish. Locals would mix the seeds with beaded darnel and create a drink called bosa, or they would smoke it in water pipes mixed with henbane. Yikes. Napoleon's troops followed suit, and when they returned to France in 1799, they brought the habit with them. This movement from Cairo to Paris is what eventually led to the Club des Hachishans, where writers like Victor Hugo, Alexandre Dumas, and Charles Baudelaire ate what was known as dawamesk, a cannabis jam imported from Arabic countries that helped them unlock creativity and explore the surreal. Of course, this euphoria didn't last forever. The real turning point, the moment Mr. Hyde took over completely, happened when the plant crossed the Atlantic and got a new name. The Spanish had originally brought the plant over there for their navy to use as rope, but the indigenous people, who already had a rich history of using psychoactive plants like peyote, began using the cannabis flowers for their own rituals and relaxation. By the time of the Mexican Revolution in 1910, smoking what was called marijuana was a common pastime for soldiers and the working class, which is celebrated in the famous folk song La Cucaracha about a cockroach who can't walk because he has no marijuana to smoke. When refugees from that war fled to the United States, they brought this custom of social smoking with them. Up until then, Americans knew cannabis as the medicine in their cough syrup, but newspapers began running sensational stories about a new foreign drug called marijuana that was driving men to violence in a propaganda campaign that changed the trajectory of the plant forever. Enter Harry Anslinger. In 1930, Anslinger was appointed the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the predecessor to the Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA. He needed a target to justify his department's budget, and he found it in marijuana. He collected what became known as the Gore Files, a dossier of police reports that linked marijuana to really gruesome crimes. He told Congress that, quote, marijuana is an addictive drug which produces in its users insanity, criminality, and death. And Anslinger didn't work alone. He had powerful allies who, according to popular theory, had their own reasons for wanting the plant gone. In 1985, activist Jack Herer proposed that industrial titans like William Randolph Hearst and the DuPont family had conspired with Anslinger. The story goes that they feared a new invention, the decorticator, would make hemp so cheap that it would destroy their paper and nylon empires. While historians now argue that hemp was too small an industry to actually threaten DuPont, the alignment was still kind of undeniable. Hearst newspapers were already printing sensational stories linking marijuana to violence and Mexican immigrants. The fear-mongering reached its peak with propaganda films like 1935's Marijuana, Assassin of Youth and 1936's Reefer Madness. These films depict cannabis users as raving lunatics who murdered their families, leapt out of windows, and descended into madness after a single puff. The message was clear. This wasn't medicine anymore. It was a threat to white middle-class America. In 1937, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act, effectively criminalizing the plant. The medical community actually protested, with one pharmacist calling it, quote, absolute rot. It is not necessary. I have never known of its misuse. 29 out of 30 pharmacists and drug company reps tried to stop the act, but they were ignored. Oh, and that 30th person? Their dissent was preserved in the files related to the act. And those reports in the Gore files, turns out they were mostly either exaggerated or completely fabricated. The final nail in the coffin came in 1970 when the Controlled Substances Act classified cannabis as a Schedule I drug, defined as having no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Cannabis was just a convenient scapegoat, transforming the plant from a botanical specimen into a political target. Whether it was a century full of grand conspiracies or just a perfect storm of racism and bureaucratic ambition, the result was the same. The Dr. Jekyll of the U.S. pharmacopoeia was erased, replaced entirely by a Mr. Hyde persona that was now, legally speaking, more dangerous than cocaine or methamphetamines. The law said the plant's reign was over. But underground, smoke signals were stronger than ever before. While Anslinger was hunting for reefer madness in the 1930s, the plant had found a sanctuary in the jazz clubs of New Orleans and Harlem. Musicians like Louis Armstrong didn't see it as a drug. They called it gauge or muggles and used it to fuel their improvisation. Armstrong famously said, quote, "It makes you feel good, man. It makes you forget all the bad things that happen to a Negro. It makes you feel wanted. And when you're with another cheese smoker, it makes you feel a special kinship." No surprise, Anslinger hated this. He specifically targeted jazz musicians, famously hounding Billie Holiday to her deathbed. But he couldn't stop the culture. By the 1950s, the baton passed to the beat poets like Allen Ginsberg and then exploded in the 1960s. Suddenly, cannabis wasn't just for jazz musicians or Mexican immigrants, it was for everyone. It became a symbol of the counterculture, a way to protest the Vietnam War and reject the establishment. For the first time, white, middle-class college kids were brazenly smoking it, and that made it impossible to ignore. The government tried to fight back with the war on drugs in the 70s and 80s, an ongoing war that has cost American taxpayers, to date, over $1 trillion, along with a $100 billion annual price tag globally, and, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, has, quote, failed to reduce drug use and failed to deter drug-related crime. These policies are simply not working, and we are failing some of the most vulnerable groups in our societies. But at the time, by getting the public to associate the other with drugs and then criminalizing it, they could disrupt what Richard Nixon's domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman, called the administration's two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. To be clear, cannabis was linked to hippies, or the so-called anti-war left, and Black people with heroin, but we're getting pedantic. Ehrlichman admitted in 1994 that the goal wasn't so much drug eradication, but to disrupt those communities, arrest their leaders, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. But there's a fundamental law in biology that the war on drugs ignored, yet every gardener knows all too well. The harder you try to kill a weed, the hardier it grows. As the DEA ramped up domestic eradication efforts and seized tons of low-potency ditchweed, they inadvertently created an evolutionary pressure cooker. Because it was too risky to smuggle bulky, low-grade leaves, the market shifted towards homegrown, smaller, high-potency varieties that were easier to hide. By the mid-1980s, despite billions of dollars spent on helicopter raids and mandatory minimum sentences, the plant was more potent, more profitable, and more available than it had ever been when the war began. It was a botanical stalemate, even with unlimited funds and resources at your disposal, you can't arrest your way out of a 30-million-year-old biological attraction. And then in the 1990s, the final wall crumbled. But this time, the hero wasn't a musician or a hippie, it was science. In 1992, researchers in Israel discovered a network of receptors in the human nervous system that were specifically designed to receive cannabinoids like the ones found in cannabis. They called it the endocannabinoid system, ECS. The scientists found a molecule produced by the human brain that binds to these receptors perfectly. They named it anandamide from the Sanskrit word ananda, meaning bliss. Both of these discoveries showed that our relationship with this plant isn't just synthetic or manufactured. Somehow, through the magic of evolution, we had made a biological lock, and cannabis just happens to have the key. Research is still ongoing on the ECS, but scientists believe it helps regulate fertility, pregnancy, pre- and postnatal development, appetite, pain, mood, memory, parts of the immune system, and aids cognitive processes. Suddenly, Dr. Jekyll was back. Medical marijuana leaves began sweeping across the United States, starting in California in 1996. We realized that for thousands of years, the physicians from Chinese Emperor Shenyang to Queen Victoria's doctors had been right all along, and the stigma's facade began to crack. Today, we're living through the plant's renaissance. We're discovering its ability to treat epilepsy, chronic pain, and PTSD. We're building homes with hempcrete, a concrete alternative that is carbon negative and fire resistant. We're even using hemp fibers to make supercapacitors for batteries. The plant that was once banished as a killer is now being hailed as a savior for both our bodies and our planet. So in the end, who's the real character? Is it the benevolent healer, Dr. Jekyll, or the chaotic Mr. Hyde? The answer, of course, is both. And as long as humans have pain to soothe, cloth to weave, or minds to explore, this weed will find a way to grow. I'm Megan Brame. Thank you for joining me on another episode of The History of Plants. Jump into the commentary episode on Patreon to see what didn't make the final cut, or if you're ready for another plant that drove the world wild, check out the episode on the opium poppy. Until next time, greenies, stay curious, and don't forget to flourish.